If you appreciate my videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help me keep on teaching, writing, and making videos, then please think about becoming a patron. I'm running a few of these kind of Q&A type sessions on Facebook over the next few weeks. I run classes and make videos and write a blog about Celtic mythology and deities mostly, but I get into things like history and that sort of thing as well. And I'm not trying to set myself up as the expert on any of these things. There are lots of people who know as much as I know, or a lot more than I know, but there seem to be a lot of people who want to know this stuff, and I'm one place people go to get it. So there you go. So I'm also doing this to promote a class I'm teaching starting at the end of June, which is called Celtic Beginnings, and all that stuff is in the introduction to this video that you'll find. So I've been asking people to send me questions, and I had a really good question asking me about Druids, and it was quite a well thought out long question. I won't read it out because it's a bit lengthy, but essentially the person said, are the modern Druids, whatever that means, connected to the ancient Druids that we know about, who were in Gaul especially, and also in Britain? And then he listed, like, are the Welsh Gorsedd of Bards connected to the Druids because they're a type of Druid? And are the various neoPagan Druids like Obod and ADF and so on, are they connected to the ancient Druids? So I'm going to attempt to answer that question without being too long-winded. And I'll start by telling you just a little bit about what we know about the ancient Druids. So that we don't have anything written by the ancient Druids because they avoided using writing. So the first thing we know about the Druids is when their name appears in some Latin Roman writings in the last few centuries BC. And it's not until the early medieval period that it occurs in both Old Irish and Middle Welsh, the mention of Druids. And that's a gap of like 1,000 years between the early Roman writings and the first writings in Celtic languages. But fairly early on in those writings in Celtic languages, Druids start to be mentioned. Now, the word Druid appears to be a Celtic word, not a Latin word. The Romans didn't make it up. And it appears to mean something like oak knower, or someone who has knowledge from oaks or knows oak trees. But it also is a word for wren that's a bird, the wren, in Celtic languages. And wrens have an association with prophecy. Now, Celtic poets and early writers have a love of double meanings for words, and a love of kind of, sometimes it's punning, but punning is usually for humorous effect, and this isn't always for humorous effect. They just seem to like words which have more than one meaning. It's all part of their mystical approach and their making you think approach to things. So the fact that it means oak knower and it also means a wren isn't really that surprising or that weird. It seems like the oldest account we have of the Druids is from Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Now that's a long time ago. We don't actually have what he wrote, but Roman writers did a lot of quoting each other. And it seems like other writers are quoting Aristotle sometimes in talking about the Druids. But one of the big influential writers in the Roman era was a guy called Posidonius, and he was around in the 2nd century BC. And he wrote a lot about the Celts and the Druids. And again, his writings haven't survived as a body of writing, but he's frequently quoted by later Roman writers. He probably influenced what Caesar had to say about the Druids, because you may know that Caesar, while he was at war with the Celts, had quite a lot to say about the Celts and the Druids. So it's probably from Posidonius that we get this idea of the three divisions of Druids. The Bards, the Ovates or Vates or Vates, and the Druids. Now my Latin is terrible, so I'm probably not saying that Ovate word right as far as Latin is concerned. So the general consensus was that the Bards were singers and poets. The Ovates oversaw sacred rites and were interested in what the Romans called natural philosophy, which we'd almost call science now, especially the more biological type of sciences or earth sciences, natural history. And the Druids, who were the highest grade within the Druids, were similar to the Ovates, but they also practiced what the Roman writers called moral philosophy, which is more like what we would call philosophy today. And they had various other things to say about these Druids, that the whole group, that they had a lot of power over the Celtic kings, and those kings would have been more like tribal lords or warlords, that kind of thing at the time. They said that they maintained the calendar, days to celebrate, good days to do things, bad days to do things. I don't know what all, we don't know what all was in the Celtic calendar or how they really perceived it. They said they knew quite a lot about astronomy. Now that would fit in with maintaining the calendar, of course. And they also claimed they knew things like the size of the earth. Maybe people knew the earth was round a long time ago. Probably not just the Druids. They acted as judges and they acted as prophets. They had a very elite status in society, in Celtic society, and they were able to move freely among the various tribes. So people in Celtic society weren't necessarily free to move between one group of people, one tribe or one territory and another. They had to make a lot of arrangements and get a lot of permissions to do that. You didn't just say, I'm going to go live with a parasite because I fancy their shrine to something, or they have nice fields or something. You just didn't do that. But the Druids could. The Druids could move freely around, and we see the same thing much, much later in Irish society. We know from the Brehon Law and so on that, again, people didn't just move around. You didn't just wander off on a trip unless you had a reason to do so. If you were a trader, for example, you would have permissions to do that. But the Druids could just, and the poets later could just go off and do that. So one reason the Romans wrote so much about the Druids is because they were at war with the Celts. So the Celts sacked Rome, they sacked Delphi, which is Greek. But, the people in the classical world were well aware of the Celts, and then around the final century of the BC period, they really went to war. The Romans really went to war with the Celts, and that, of course, was led by Julius Caesar, who also wrote a lot about the Celts. But because they were at war with the Celts, and Caesar was interested in his own reputation, it's quite possible that not everything the Romans, especially Caesar, wrote about the Celts was entirely truthful, or it may have been exaggerated, or there may have been spin put on it. So, for instance, if you say your enemies are really fierce, then if you defeat them, that makes you look better. On the other hand, if you say your enemies are also maybe a bit stupid or not very advanced as a society, that's an excuse for conquering them, because you can then say, we brought them civilization. So there are a couple of specific things that are likely overstated or exaggerated or possibly wrong. One thing is the thing about human sacrifice. It's quite possible that the Druids did do some human sacrifice at some periods, maybe not at other periods, maybe in some places, not others. We don't know the reasons for that. But it's very likely, because the Romans didn't practice human sacrifice at the time, that they would use that as something to say, well, the Druids are really bad because they sacrifice people. Obviously, the Romans were very bad in the way they treated other humans as well. They, put them in all sorts of horrible situations. They didn't do what they saw as actual human sacrifice at the time, so that made the Druids bad. That was a good reason to attack the Celts, because their priests did human sacrifice. They also state that the Druids preached reincarnation, which is probably true. The result of this was that it made the Celts absolutely fearless in battle. And that may be true as well, but they kind of hinted that maybe that's why the Druids preached reincarnation. It tricked the warriors into throwing themselves into battle without any concern for their own survival. The Roman military and the Roman leaders over a few centuries also considered that the Druids were really dangerous because they stirred up revolt against the Romans. So they saw a lot of the anti-Roman sentiment and the incitement to war against them as coming from the Druids, and that may well be true. They also said that Britain was kind of the seat of Druidism, or that's where people went to learn to be Druids. That's where Druidism was emanating from, and there's no way for us to know for sure whether that's true or not. It seems very widespread, and it's survived well in Britain, so that it could be true or partly true, but it was certainly used as an excuse to invade Britain. One of the reasons they wanted to invade Britain was to put the Druids down. And Caesar tried to invade Britain. He didn't get very far, and then about 100 years later, the Romans really did invade Britain, and a lot of it was quite bloody at first, naturally. And in AD 60, you probably know, a queen called Boudica led a revolt against the Romans, and during that revolt, the Romans got really angry, and they attacked Anglesey, the Isle of Anglesey, which is part of what's now North Wales. And apparently, according to the Romans, and there's no reason to disbelieve it, there was a great seat of Druids there, a great center for Druidism, which the Romans destroyed. Now, there's not much archaeological evidence of this thing. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. But the idea that this attack completely wiped out the Druids is obviously false, and you occasionally hear neopagans being really angry about that. It's a bit late, but I do get that, and I'm sure that the attack was ill-intentioned on the part of the Romans, and they really did want to, destroy something that was very important to the Druids and kill lots of Druids, but they didn't completely wipe out Druidism. We know that because it's still being mentioned in medieval Wales and Ireland, early medieval period. What we don't know is whether some lore, the knowledge of the Druids, could have been lost in that attack on Anglesey, or how much their status may have been reduced because of it. So they might have had to go underground, for example. What seems to have happened over time is that many of the roles that the Druids filled were increasingly taken over by an elite class of poets, and these were called bards in Britain and Fili, F-I-L-I, in Ireland. So in medieval Irish literature, we find Druids mentioned in mythology and in the law tracts and so on. In mythology, they're often portrayed as having prophetic powers. They act as advisors to kings, and sometimes they work magic. And often both their prophecy and their magic has a poetic element, even when they're being referred to as druids. The Irish Fili also had immense power in Ireland, just like the Romans say about the Druids. And one reason is because they had the power to satirize kings, and their satire could actually bring kings down. It could, end your reign, the satire of the Druids, and for that reason, or the satire of the Fili, rather, pardon me, and for that reason the kings were kind of afraid of them and tended to give them whatever they asked for, in the form of patronage and money and land and stuff. So we know from the early Irish laws that there were still people around called Druids into the early medieval period, but it seems like their status, the status of people actually called Druids, not the poets, really went down, and they were more like sorcerers or that sort of thing. While the poets' power seems to have grown, their status and power seems to have grown for quite a few centuries. And yes, I have notes here. See me turning pages. You get a much smoother ride from me if I have notes. So the situation in Britain is a little bit different. Christianity made bigger inroads in Britain sooner, and of course Ireland didn't suffer a Roman occupation, which Britain did. So because of these two things, the Druids were probably suppressed more and lost more status sooner. And that might account for the word Druid being used much less in early Welsh writing. So we find poets or bards in an extremely powerful position in Britain, probably from something like the 4th or 5th century when the Romans left until maybe the 12th century. And of course they may have been powerful among the Celts, among the British Celts while the Romans were there, and as I said, might have just been kind of underground. We don't have any writing from Britain in that period, from the Celtic Britons, so it's hard to say. It's easy, though, to see, looking at early British or Welsh poetry, like the Book of Taliesin, that much of the bard's poetry was very mystical and probably intentionally difficult to understand. And they were actively working to create an air of mystery about themselves. They didn't seem to use satire against the kings the way the Irish poets did. There's still a strong sense that they're not to be messed with, that they could maybe do something to you. They have powers that other people don't have, and knowledge that other people don't have. And they had a very symbiotic relationship with the kings and leaders, because they praised the leaders, the kings and so on, at public events frequently. And they also kept the genealogy of all the different noble families in good order. And of course this was still all mostly done orally. Writing was beginning to come into play, but for the most part it seems the poets were still very fixed on memorization of all this stuff. And one of the things that they did with their keeping of the mythology and the genealogy was connect the leading families, the warrior elite, the kings especially, to the gods as being their ancestors, or their ancestors as being gods, however you want to look at it. So both in Britain and Ireland, a major function of what we're now more calling poets than druids was that of lore keeping. The use of writing, like I say, was coming in, but the poets, we know even in the late medieval period and even as late as the 17th century, were still quite obsessed with memorizing things and keeping lots and lots of knowledge in their memories. So they still didn't trust writing as a very good way to hang on to stuff. And perhaps Perhaps they had other reasons too for preferring that. Like, it's harder to take somebody's stuff away if it's in their head than if it's written down in a book. Now, by the 19th century, there was a renewed interest in the Celts, and people began to realize that the languages people spoke in Wales and Ireland and other regions were Celtic in origin, because this had been forgotten. People had lost track of this knowledge. People didn't realize that Irish and Welsh were related, for example, because they're not really mutually intelligible. So this Celtic revival of literature and of identity led to an interest in the Druids again. And that really started a little earlier in the 18th century, but it really caught fire in the 19th century. And you may have heard of a guy called Iolo Morganwg, who was a brilliant poet and a brilliant scholar, and also a little bit of a forger of ancient lore. And I'm not really an authority on Iolo or the Druid revival, and I'm not going to go too deep into that, so we're getting near the end. But Iolo was the one who really solidified some new ideas about the early Druid revival. And this still wasn't neopaganism in any way. Iolo was a Christian, he believed in Christ, all of that. But he was bringing in influences from Masonic rites and maybe a bit of ceremonial magic, but still strongly Christian, and there was still a big emphasis on poetry and cultural material. So that led directly to what we find in Wales today, an organization called the Gorsedd of Bards. And they're responsible for holding the Eisteddfodau, which are like competitions of poetry and music and so on, and a celebration of Welsh culture. And there's a lot of pomp and ceremony and dressing up in robes associated with that. So the Gorsedd of Bards are definitely a type of Druid organization, but they're not pagans. And if you hear about, the Queen of England or the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, are also Druids. Now, Rowan Williams is a member of the Gorsedd of Bards. There's no reason that a British Archbishop can't be a member of the Gorsedd of Bards because it's a secular, slightly Christian organization. The Queen was honorarily brought in when she was in her youth, but in fact they brought her out again because she never bothered to learn Welsh. So she's not actually a Druid anymore. So it wasn't really until the mid-20th century that Nichols, who was a friend of Gerald Gardner is the founder of Wicca, started a really neoPagan Druid organization. And this was really still kind of in the infancy of new paganism. And he founded something which became known as the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, abbreviated OBOD, O-B-O-D. I think they're the largest pagan Druid order both in the UK and in the world right now. I'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. So no modern Druid order can really be said to be like the ancient Druids for several reasons, and I think those reasons are important to understand. They're not particularly concerned with lore keeping. Oh yeah, they would encourage people to maybe memorize a story or two or a bit of lore, but that's not an important function for them. They don't lead a popular state religion. They're not in any kind of position of power. They're not elite in our society. They're seen very much as a kind of lunatic fringe, if anything. I'm not saying they are, but that's how they're viewed, by wider society. Their function is very different, and it certainly has changed what it means to be a Druid. And they would probably say they've updated Druidry, which is fair enough, or kind of reinvented it. And that's what we have to say about them. They're not connected to ancient Druids. They're maybe inspired by ancient Druids. So I'll give just a very brief overview of a few of the biggest, most popular Druid organizations, how they're different. And I apologize if I get any of this wrong, but I think it's broadly accurate. So I mentioned Obod. They're very universalist, and so while I say they're neoPagan, that's broadly true, but they welcome people of any belief into their organization. They draw on deities from Britain and Ireland in their rituals, but they tend to treat them as archetypes rather than in a polytheistic way that they're deities in the way a theologian would understand what a deity is, I suppose. This is all very hard stuff to define. And like most modern Druid orders, there's a big emphasis on self-improvement. Now, I think ADF, one of their names is A Druid Fellowship, so that's ADF, is the largest order in the US. They don't have a great deal of influence outside the US. And they're very different than Obod. They have a polytheistic and religious approach to things. They have a focus on training clergy, and their seasonal rituals are open to the public. And many neopagans who aren't members of ADF, who don't consider themselves to be Druids, attend these rituals in some places. Certainly, I've been to some in Portland, and they're really big. They're really well attended. And ADF considers that aspect to be an important part of their work, that they provide well thought out polytheistic rituals at the wheel of the year points for the wider community, and anybody can come, and that their rituals are pretty much going to be the same anywhere you go to an ADF ritual. It will have pretty much the same components. In Britain, there's another large Druid organization called the BDO, which stands for British Druid Order. And they have a lot in common with Obod, and I think their leader, Philip Shallcross, probably came out of Obod. They describe their work as being more shamanic in nature, however you want to define that. But like I said, they have a lot in common with Obod, and it's important to understand that all of the Druid orders that I know of, I'm sure some of the smaller ones, this would not be true, but the big Druid orders all seem to make a real effort to get along, and there's a lot of, people are members of more than one Druid order quite often. They're not at war with each other. They're not fighting each other. They just have different approaches. And the final group I'll mention is AODA, the Ancient Order of Druids in America. Now, they're a little bit different. They were founded in 1912, so before neopaganism was happening. And they came out of something called the Ancient Order of Druids, which was started in Britain. And they were more like a friendly society with roots in secular Druidism and Masonic rites. And AODA is still probably the least officially neopagan of the four I've mentioned. And they have a strong emphasis these days on ecology and understanding about your bioregion and stuff like that. It's a big part of their training, is for people to understand more about natural history. There's lots more Druid orders, whether they're neopagan or secular or cultural. For instance, Brittany and Cornwall have their own version of the Gorsedd of Bards. And there are, I don't know how many neopagan Druid orders, some of them quite small. But the four that I've mentioned, Obod, ADF, BDO, and AODA. They all have websites, and if you really want to know what they believe and what they do, it's on their websites. You can check them out. None of these Druid orders are really direct descendants of the Ancient Druids, and I don't think any of them claim to be at all. They are pretty well aware of what their history is and where Druids, the Celtic Druids, sit in history. They're just inspired by it. They're inspired by it. And they grow out of a time when people were more ready to be inspired by that and were a bit more, still had a bit more romantic ideas about the Druids than I have, than a lot of people I think have today who know about Celtic stuff. So I've got a few more of these coming up, and you're very welcome to leave questions. Ask me something that you'd like me to talk about another time, and I'll try. So thanks for listening, and I'll hopefully see you again. Bye-bye.